Yo, yo, yo. We are here for the second episode of the Fireside PM podcast. And I have a very special guest. I have Mina, who I worked with, golly, that must have been like 12, 13 years ago at
Yeah,
Google.
2008. 2000.
Yeah. And I enjoyed our brief overlap and have been sort of following your career since then, and it's been amazing. I was just looking at your LinkedIn profile. What a journey you've been on. You've got Goldman, Google, ModCloth, Cowboy Ventures. Now you're the CEO of a startup in Australia. Like, you have definitely uh, you know, lived a exciting career already, and you're just getting started. But how would you describe yourself? Who's Mina?
Yeah, it's funny, Tom, like when you look at the career, it's like, whoa, all these different places, and then it's only kind of like in hindsight that you can kind of
Mm,
see like what the dots were that like connected everything. So really, like Goldman was one of those things where it was actually I was doing the co-op program at Cornell. So
mm-hmm,
the co-op computer science program was like you basically your last 2 years, junior and senior year, you are switching off semesters and working in New York City. And I think, to be honest, like, like Goldman gave me an offer to come join them in like September of my senior year. And I was like, yeah, New York City, that's awesome. Let's go. It'll be really fun.
it's
And
not Ithaca.
it's definitely not Ithaca, thank goodness. Um, and so yeah, and I love the team. I've been working with the investment banking team actually at Goldman, and like building like BlackBerry apps back when that was cutting edge technology, like genuinely cutting edge technology in like 2004. And so like I went to join them, and I was just like, I learned so much. I really got to be part of this like really. I feel like for anybody honestly starting out in their career, like working at a larger company, like a Goldman or even a Google, like it's such a great way to start your career because you learn so much about sort of like organizational scaffolding. Like you don't have to worry about the in between pieces. Like it's already there for you, and then you can just
Mm,
focus on the interiors, right? And that's not to say that like so. Honestly, in my personal opinion, I think it's actually much better to go to a large company to start out your career than to go to a startup. Um, because while you learn a lot at a startup, I think that there's hygiene factors that are just missing and that you don't pick up unless you work at a large company. And so anyway, so I was at Goldman for 3 years. I really, really enjoyed it. But like it's not a technology company, right? Like it runs on
mhm,
technology, it can't exist without technology. But like at the end of the day, like if you look at a balance sheet, right? It's like it's assets versus liabilities, like or
mhm.
profit versus loss. Like, technology is on the loss side. And I really want to be the place where tech is the thing that drives that company forward. I have this like, by the way, it's not really mentioned in my LinkedIn, but like I had this kind of like, weird mix where I like went to business school but dropped out of business school and then ended up going to Google instead. Mostly because I didn't get into Harvard, and I was like, I don't really want to go anywhere else. But this other school offered me like a full scholarship, and I was like, well, I really should take it. I don't want to stay at Goldman. So I got the scholarship, went to business school for all of like a week or two, like met all my friends, did all the onboarding,
Oh
and
boy.
and I'd been interviewing for the APM program at Google, but I hadn't heard anything back in like 2 months. And I was like, well,
Mm,
I'm not going to sit around and wait for this. Like, I need to move on with my life. And then the recruiter called me up. So it's Friday. The recruiter calls me up. Classes are supposed to start on Tuesday. And he says, hey, your offer's in, we've FedEx your offer to you. It's coming. You get it on the weekend. So I got it on Saturday. I thought about it. I walked into the dean's office on Monday and dropped out of school. And then took 2 months off and moved to California to come work at Google and join the APM program. Um, which in hindsight is probably one of the best decisions I've ever made. So I was at Google there for 3 years. And it was a tech company, and I wanted to be in San Francisco and like in the heart of technology.
mhm.
And obviously, like an amazing experience. Like I really, really loved being part of the APM program. Got to do a ton of stuff, work with people like you, Tom, and other awesome PMs. And but then I got bitten by the startup bug. And I was just like, I don't want to be at a big company anymore. I have to work at a startup. Now I've done the big company thing. Now I'm ready for a startup. And so, like again, very randomly, I met the I met the CPO or the CXO. He ran product technology and product design and engineering, and there were no product managers at the time at
Mm.
ModCloth. I literally ran into him at a lunch at South by Southwest. And I was a big fan of ModCloth. Like I was a shopper. Like, so I used to buy stuff from them all the time. And I somehow find myself sitting next to this guy at lunch. He's telling me, I work at this, fashion company. I'm like, oh, what's it called? ModCloth. I was like, oh my God, I love ModCloth so much. It's so great. Let me tell you about all these things though I wish you did. And so we got to talking, and they had just raised their Series A and were
Mm.
looking for their first product manager to come join them. And so he asked me to come join them, and I was like, okay, sounds like a plan. Let's do it. So I left Google and went to go join ModCloth. And it's funny because like I was in ModCloth for a full year, and I felt like I'd come full circle in my career, where I was ostensibly working in tech, in a tech role, but for a company that had to rely on tech, but ultimately tech's not the thing that drives it.
Mm.
Because at ModCloth, like the key thing is like, what's the dress on the front page? What's selling, right? And so it's really
Mhm.
a marketing and merchandising company that's at the heart of it, at the core of what they're trying to do. And so I felt like, okay, well, I've learned a lot from being here. I've learned more about tax than I've ever wanted to know. And a lot of the like really core things about e-commerce, like shipping platforms, building checkouts, how to think about like, tax and returns and all of these things, like really core parts of e-commerce. Like I worked on building all of those things, and I definitely like it was a great like I feel like I know that industry just like really deeply because of that year of like going through it. Um, but again, I was like, hey, I love the startup experience, and I love being a startup PM. It's a very different kind of way of working. I really want to be in a technology company,
Mhm.
and there was this thing where it's like, oh, this thing called mobile's just come out. Like there's this new device. It's this iPhone 3G, and so like I was like, that's what I want to do. I really want to get into mobile. That feels like the future. Like keep in mind, this is 2010, right? So
Mhm.
again, a long time ago.
Yeah.
Um, and one of my, I don't know if you ever knew, did you ever know Tom Tungas?
No, I didn't.
So Tom was at Google in the APM program as well, and then he had gone to become a VC at Redpoint, and so and Tom and I had become good friends, and so I reached out to Tom. I was like, hey, I'm looking for a company, and I want it to be a startup company, and I want it to be in the mobile world. Like,
Mm.
here's a list that I put together. Do you know people at any of these companies? And he's like, oh yeah, I know this one. Like, let me introduce you to this guy Travis, and he did, and so and so I had this long like 45-minute conversation with Travis one night.
Mhm.
This is early 2011, right? So, and I just like, I really, really enjoyed it. And so I spent the next like week and a half interviewing this little company at the time called Uber, who was looking for their first product manager. And I joined them. And there's so much to talk about with Uber. But anyway, like, so I joined them. It was like early 2011. And it's, we could talk for hours about it. I won't go into detail, but like, I was there for 4 years. I was their first PM, ultimately ended up growing, running, building, hiring a PM team. It was like 20 people when I left, roughly 4 years later. And then I took a break for a while because 4 years at Uber was like, I think 10 years anywhere else. And then I played at being an investor, venture capitalist for like a year. I joined Redpoint as an entrepreneur in residence. I was working with Cowboy Ventures, and really just trying to get a sense of like, what does it mean to be an investor, and what does the VC world look like, and how
Mm.
does it operate? Because for me, I was kind of like, look, I've done the PM at a big company thing, and I enjoyed it, but I don't think that's the path for me. I've done the startup PM, be the first PM, build it up, grow the team, do all of that. I've done that several times over. I don't want to do it again. So I really love product. I love tech. I love startups. So like, where are the two kind of like paths for me that make sense? Either it's investor or it's founder.
Mhm.
Um, so I did the investor thing for a while, and to get a sense of what it meant, because I just had no idea, honestly, having just been an operator my whole life. And then I was like, you know what? I've done this for a year. I've learned a lot. I get it from this perspective, but actually, what I want to do is go be a founder. And so that was like, I guess 2017 to 2016-ish. And yeah, and so I've been on the founder journey ever since. And we just raised our Series B, which is super exciting. So we raised $25 million. Um, yeah, and moved to Australia, started a company, and done the whole founder thing, and just finished raising our. And that's where we are today.
Oh my God. I am so glad that we're going to have a little time to unpack. There's a lot here. And I mean, I guess the first thing that you talked about, by the way, congrats on this Series B. I mean, that's
Oh, thank
awesome.
you. Yeah, yeah.
So
No, it's
I'm
exciting.
sure that was a lot of work to get there. Um, your first advice about starting out in a larger company out of college, I've heard the opposite from a lot of people saying like, "Oh, you learn the most at startups." And you were talking about hygiene and sort of scaffolding. Can you elaborate a little more on that?
Yeah, like I mean, the thing with startups, right? What they're it's the double-edged sword. Like they're crazy and they're intense and you do a lot.
Mhm.
But the thing is that like you have so much going on around you. Like the real challenge is trying to prioritize and figure out like what is the most important thing to work on. And so having a good framework by which to do that, having a way in which you can sort of objectively analyze like mess and chaos is something
Mhm.
that you need to come up with, right? Now, if you're like 21, straight out of college, you maybe you'll have that. I know I didn't. And so like I felt like what I learned from things like Goldman and Google were that people had made those mistakes, built processes and like figured out all of the things in those processes that could work. Like there are times where it can be overly bureaucratic. That's okay. But if you're in it and you sort of follow that whole thing end to end, you can pull out the things that don't make sense and keep the stuff
Mhm.
that does. Whereas like I just feel like if you when you're joining that startup, like you're just everything is like all hands on deck all the time. And it's kind of like, okay, hope for the best, see how it goes. And you don't know. Like there's not necessarily people around you that haven't made those mistakes before. Sometimes you're lucky and they are, and they'll be like, oh, trust me, this one's not quite the right way to go. Here's a great thing to do. Like if you have really experienced founders or you have those, but like you don't always. And so I feel like what you get from having gone through the several years at a big company, and I don't mean like 10 years at a big company. I'm talking about like 2 or 3.
Mhm.
Um, I think is incredibly valuable in terms of this like really core understanding of like frameworks and ways of working and just a certain level of just like professional demeanor and respect that I think like is really important to bring into companies.
Do you feel like that applies to late stage startups as well, or like what when does a startup
No.
start?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's a good point is like making this distinction between like startup versus late stage startup. I think a late stage startup is awesome in that sense, and that like
Mhm.
there's a lot like you get a lot of the pros on both sides of the like big company
Mhm.
startup place. So yeah, I think like if I have to revise my advice, it would be like late stage startup or larger company. It depends on kind of like where it goes, but I think that like super early stage startups, like call it, yeah, I don't even want to say the letters anymore because it's kind of like the letters are so insane. Like I was reading about a company today, pre-launch, $50 million Series A. Like, what is that? That's not an A. I have no idea what that is actually. But like what I'm talking about when I say startups is companies that have raised, call it either nothing or bootstrap, or like let's say less than like $7 or $8 million. Like
Mhm.
very, very like that kind of company, like maybe like 2 or 3 years, at
Yeah.
most that. Where I think that you get a lot of the chaos, but you don't necessarily like coming straight out of school are best equipped to make the most of that time.
So tell me a little bit about your startup experience at Uber as the first PM. I mean, that place was pretty famous for being pretty intense. What was your what was your experience like working there?
I mean, look, I have so many. There are things about Uber. Obviously, I wasn't. I left basically like 26 end of 2016,
Mm.
early 2017. So I wasn't there for I think a lot of the like blowback that's come out of it.
Mhm.
So it's hard for me to speak. I can't speak to really any of that. I would say that it definitely changed a lot during the time that I was there. The first like 2 to 3 years that I was at Uber, oh god, it was amazing. Like just such a great group of people. Learned so much. Like and I got to be part of something like really from the ground up, and
Mm.
that's really special because there's not many companies that grow the way that Uber's grown. And when you're a part of that from very early on, like I have a lot of gratitude for what I learned and what I got to work on and what I did when I was there.
What was it like being a PM um, at a startup where the founder I mean, I've heard the argument that it's hard to be a PM at a startup because like the founders kind of the head of product in many ways, oftentimes because they have a very clear vision and they know what they want. And were you able to kind of lead in the way you wanted to, or was it like, hey, it was just a rocket ship? I was, just enjoying this amazing experience.
Yeah, no, I think that Travis deserves a lot of credit for giving people autonomy. Absolutely, like he's
Mm,
can be a very strong-minded individual, has like a very strong point of view, but like I never felt like I couldn't try or do the things that I wanted to do. Like I felt like I was able to have really good conversations with him about it. Sometimes he would veto things, of course, that's the nature of how it goes. But in general, like I actually like I think that's a real skill. Like I think for me, certainly, like I feel like I play both co-founder slash CEO and head of product. And what I'm probably going to end up doing is hiring a head of product at some point in the next sort of like yeah. So I'm pregnant with my second child, so I'm due in 4 weeks. So I'm going to go on maternity leave. First time in my life that I've ever gone on maternity leave. I'm kind of like not really sure what to expect, to be honest. But um, so after I come back, I will hire a head of product, I think, because it makes sense at this stage of the company for me to pull back from that role a little bit. And
mm.
I think that there's a lot of things that I'm going to take from my experience at Uber around it, where it's just like you want to it's choosing the level at which you want to be involved, right? Where it's I think that the CEO is very important from setting like the strategy and making sure that it's aligned with like business objectives. But when it comes to like the specifics around what is the specific problem we're trying to solve and how are we going to solve it, I think that's best left to the product teams to be able to run and manage that.
Now, when you joined Uber, were they like doubling every month, or like what was it like there when you
No, I
first
mean,
got
it
there?
was growing incredibly fast still, but
Yeah.
like it was, so we had, let's see, I joined in like early 2011 and we had just launched New York City. That was our second city. So we launched San Francisco in November 2010, and then we launched New York, I think, February or March
Mm-hmm.
2011. And then I joined just after that. And so it was still like early days. We were still growing. We're still growing quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, I can't even remember. Like every week we would have our all hands and be like, best week ever, best week it was constant like growth.
Yeah.
Like obviously it's grown incredibly fast. But it was still like early days. Like I can distinctly remember the first at least year minimum of working at Uber. Like I would say to somebody, in a casual conversation, oh yeah, I work at Uber, and they'd be like, oh, what's Uber?
Mm.
Like you can't imagine that today, but like it definitely was like that for a long time. Like we genuinely were a startup for a very long time.
What kind of product problems were you solving in those days?
Oh gosh, what was the first one? One of the first ones was just thinking about like pricing and like how do we show it in the app and how does it work. Um, it was also like another big one was just like credit cards. So I don't know if you remember this, but like there was for a long time that you could only have one credit card. You couldn't have more than
Mm.
one.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember it was like, well, hey, we probably should allow people to have more than one credit card because like people need to switch between cards.
Yeah.
And I remember like this is a funny story, like where I was like, hey, I found this really cool thing where it's just like, it's really hard to remember your credit card numbers and stuff. What if you could just scan your credit card and it automatically like pulled it up, right? So that
Mm-hmm.
that was mine. Like I was the first person to kind of like work on and build that and build it into an app. I remember telling Travis, I was like, Travis, it's gonna be really fun. Like people will enjoy it. He's like, oh, it's just a gimmick. No one's gonna care. And it's funny, we launched it, and like the next day, there were like 50 stories about it all over like TechCrunch and like all of
Yeah.
the blogs. And they're like, this is so cool. This is so amazing. And then everyone copied it after that. I was like, damn, I should have patented it.
I think I remember. I remember using it on Uber to enter a credit card that way. Yeah. That was thank you for doing that. Cause then you always like type the wrong number or you fat finger it and you gotta redo the whole darn thing. So being able to scan it was always convenient. Tell me about building out the Uber PM team. What kinds of like were you looking for like what how did you go about thinking about like constructing the team and evaluating people and finding the right folks?
Yeah, I think like one of the things that I definitely was learning was like how do you construct a PM team as it grows in a marketplace startup, right?
Mm,
And especially because you need to think about like one. the one obvious way that might come to mind is, oh, well, you put one person in charge of one side of the marketplace, then you put another person in charge of the other side of the marketplace, then you have another person that like manages internal stuff, and then you have another
Mm-hmm.
person that does like analytics. And that is absolutely how I constructed this to begin with, right? And as I'm
Mm-hmm.
going through it, I was like, oh yeah, this is just like, so that's how you start. So you think about like, okay, who's got a really consumer facing view of it?
Mm-hmm.
Who's got like a consumer facing view, but like for almost an, like the way that you think about a rider is incredibly different than the way you think about a driver. And
Mm-hmm.
so like looking at people who could like look at both of those aspects and consider like how they would build for somebody like you think you know what a rider needs, right? Because like you can put yourself in those shoes, but a driver, like that's a completely different way of thinking about the world. And so like how do you find people who are going to have that approach and that attitude? How do you find somebody deeply analytical that like really thinks about like the hard like technical problems in geofencing? Like how do you build geofencing? How do you think of surge pricing, or
Mm-hmm.
how navigation works, or like how to work with maps? Like so there's different like kind of needs, right? Like there's, you want super technical PMs, for example, who can handle like that kind of thinking and work with like really serious like data scientists to try and figure out how to bring that back into the product. And then you want people who are like who love internal products, you know, who like it's, I think like one thing that happens, and especially like it's that people like there's a sexiness factor to the products you work on as a PM, right? Everyone wants to work on like the consumer facing mobile app, and yes, okay, it's cool, whatever, it's sexy, but like it's also not always the most important thing. And so I think for me, like one of the things that I really tried to do as like we grew the team was to rethink the approach of how PMs should be set up, and set them up as like owning like kind of like end to end slices, right? So like you're not just responsible for a consumer facing mobile app. Actually, you've got to build all of the internal tooling that goes behind that to allow that to happen. So for example, if you want to introduce like offers and discounts into to riders, you also have to do all of the work around how do you administer offers and discounts from an internal perspective so that you can actually like own that whole thing end to end and make sure that it works. And then how does it show to drivers, if at all? When does it come into play? How does it relate back to billing systems? So like that person really thinks through the whole thing end to end. And I think that for me, like that's been a really something I've tried to like bring in now very early on into my teams here. So now I have a 5-person product team. At different, and that's something that like from the very first person I hired, it was like, okay, you're going to have like complete responsibility. So like part of what we've done with that too is like rebuild our apps to not be native apps but to be React native apps, so that we can get kind of like the right level of like engineering expertise so that every
Mm-hmm.
single team can build on mobile. Because you know everybody wants to work on mobile, I get it, everybody wants to work on consumer stuff, but it's not enough. You don't just get to work on the consumer side. You have to think about how that relates back, especially if you have like an operational business, which we do.
So is the engineering org also structured that way, where it's kind of vertically integrated into these end-to-end like journeys that they can support?
Yeah,
Oh,
so like
interesting.
we've got product
Yeah.
teams,
Uh-huh.
and the product or experience teams, like they work on it, they own an entire area. And those engineers are like completely full stack and focused on all of the things. They could be working on React Native one day, they could be working in like, you
Hmm.
know, web products another day, they could be doing something else very back end, they could be building other algorithms. And then we also have platform teams that are primarily just all engineers. So like an example of a platform team is mobile platform. What does mobile platform do, right? Mobile platform is responsible for like the release train. They're responsible for the analytics infrastructure around mobile. They're responsible, for example, implementing something like code push so that we could like work within it, or building the components for the mobile app so that other people can just pick them up and start to build products on top of it. What they don't do is build product features for the most part. Like they're there is they
Mm-hmm.
know how to, and they can. They act as consultants, and so they teach other people on teams. They're kind of like roving consultants that like teach people how to do good React Native work and thinking and architecture. But they themselves are figuring out how to build a mobile platform that any engineer can then go and do work on top of. So that's the way that we think about it here, is that the engineers, the product managers, and the designers are grouped together into an area of sort of like ownership, and they have the full end-to-end autonomy around like all the products. They'll release to mobile, and they'll release on web, and they'll have like communications and backend and everything else that needs to go with it. And then the platform teams are focused on making that process as easy as possible for people to build on it.
Very cool. Tell me a little bit about how you've learned or lessons you've learned on hiring great PMs. How do you find the right people?
For me, one of the biggest things I think is like the take home challenge and trying to have a good take home challenge, right? Like the key is not about like the solution that they, at the end of the day, what I found is like the best PMs often come up with really good solutions. But the solution itself is so unimportant compared to like the way in which they work, the thought process and how they go through it. So my take home challenges, like the way that I usually frame them, they're meant to be something that you spend maybe 3 hours on. And they are a problem that is generally related to the business itself, because I want people to work on something that they don't have a lot of context on. And I frame it as like, I don't really care about your solution. I actually just want to see your process and the thought process and how you go through. And for me, like the biggest indicator in like whether or not somebody's going to be a strong PM is like the way that they structure their answer to take home exercise. It's not even, it's the answers. Yes, they come there, but it's actually the like the formatting of like, okay, step one, step two, step three,
Mm-hmm.
step four. This is my breakdown of like how I'm going to go through this. And here are the things I'm going to assume. Here are the things that I, as a result of that assumption, I've decided to do. But it's like, it's that process
Mm-hmm.
where when you have that level of rigor and thought, like I'm just like, this person's going to be a good PM. And it's almost irrelevant what their background is. It's like when they can approach it with that level of rigor and thought, I know they're going to do a good job.
Well, that's a very big emphasis on that take home work. And it sounds like less of an emphasis on the traditional loop of interviews and, estimate the number of golf balls kind of thing.
Oh yeah, I'll do this too every once in a while, but it's really like to me like that's less important from an analytic like the analytical standpoint is like baked into the take home exercise, but it's like
Mm-hmm.
my structure around interviews is sort of like it's threefold. So step one is like a just like a first round interview because you have to have strong communication skills as a product
Mm-hmm.
manager. And a lot of product managers are pretty good at talking. They can do it, right? Like they can, they can shoot the shit, as it were, for people. And so,
Mm-hmm.
like, after you've done, I mean, at this point, I have no idea how many product interviews I've done, but like hundreds easily at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And that first sort of 30-45 minute conversation, like you get a really good sense of like how someone thinks, what they do, what they care about, whether or not you want to work with them, right? So that's step one. And then from there, it usually goes to the take home exercise. If the take home exercise is really strong, I'll generally move them directly into like a series of like in person interviews with a mix of people. So it'll be with engineering, with design, maybe with product, depends on like, whether or not I think it's important. Um, and also with stakeholders like operations or growth or marketing in the team. And then we'll do a debrief after on that stage. If a take home exercise is good but not great, then often what I'll do is I'll do a follow up and see if like the way that they explain it to me didn't necessarily come across in the way that like the person returned the exercise. And which people do in all kinds of different ways. Some people create Figma, some people create decks, some people write a
Mm-hmm.
product outline, some people, I don't know, build a video, some people build a prototype. Like it's all like, all different. People can do whatever they want to do. Um, and then depending on that, so I might have this extra kind of in between step where it's like, okay, let's do a one-on-one and you talk to me about like your exercise and how it actually went and where it goes to. But typically that's kind of the three-step process that I like to follow. And with that final set of interviews with different people, I'll ask them to focus on different areas. So like
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, design is super important as well because I want them to be very collaborative and I want them to have a respect for product design,
Mm-hmm.
and be a partner to that person. So like each interviewer will have kind of like, hey, here's the like specific areas that I want you to focus on, and then those are the kinds of things that people will come back with. And we do use a lot of the Google tactics, honestly. Like we look for people have to kind of vote for who it is, and it's strong yes or it's yes or no. There's no in between, right? Like you have to be a yes or a no. You can be strong yes or a weak yes, but you
Mm-hmm.
can't be.
And how important is the previous work experience, education, that kind of stuff?
Mm, education. I don't really honestly spend a lot on it. Previous work experience, I do like to look at, like especially startup work experience, because I
Mm-hmm.
think you have to be ready to be a startup PM. There's a certain level of madness. It's just the reality of the kind of the business and the way it goes, and you have to be really adaptable. So, like for example, I think that like I think one of the strengths of Google PMs is consensus building, right? Like there's a lot of that to happen, and that's the nature of I think working through larger organizations, and that there's a ton of work and thought that goes into companies where you have to do that. That's not necessarily going to be the strength that will help you the most at an organization of our size. So it's something where it's like I those aren't necessarily the skills that I'm looking for where we are as a company. It would be something I think that I look for as I hire a head of product or a VP of product, because I think that's really important in terms of like managing executive stakeholders and having those conversations with them. But like looking for like just like a mid-level or senior PM, it's not something that I sort of tend to look for. So education to me less important, experience somewhat important. I think the other thing that's changed a little bit for me as I've been hiring PMs is like Google, like my background is in computer science. Google obviously has a strong bias towards like CSE engineer like
Mm-hmm.
kind of degrees. I think that's actually really important. I just don't think you have to have the CS degree in order to prove your technical chops. I do think like I ask my engineers, the engineers who interview our PMs to like actually test their engineering knowledge, right? Like, can they explain, for example, how a browser works? Do they actually understand the infrastructure and the architecture behind that? Or like the questions of that ilk. So that's really important to me that they can do it. I just don't think you have to have a CS degree in order to be able to do that.
Yeah, it's definitely. I remember at Google in the early days, that was a very strong requirement. And
Yeah.
but a lot of our PM leads at that time actually were not CS majors when they were in undergrad. So there's definitely some gray area there. But certainly you want people that can, understand hard technical problems and work with engineering leads and stuff. Tell me a little bit about your VC experience. So you were on the dark side for a little while. What was that like? Saying no to all those poor entrepreneurs.
No, you say no so often. Oh God, it's hard actually. Because I think like the biggest thing was just like you want to get involved in the product and you know that your role is like can't get involved in the product at all, have no say in
Mm,
that, like can't do anything, can't do it myself. Would I
mm,
still back the person to make the right choices? And that was honestly one of the hardest pieces of it for me. But yeah, so many no's, so many good companies that and you just never know. I definitely remember companies that I like advocated really strongly for. I was like, we should invest, we should put a check into these guys, and then like
mm.
didn't always get there, but like and again, you never know. And then I look at some of these companies that I was like huge advocates for, and like I don't know, my hit rate's probably 50-50 as well. Like some of them have definitely like fallen apart, gone to nothing. Some of them like told you guys, I told you that one was going to be
Yeah. Well,
big.
50-50 is pretty awesome.
But yeah, you just never know. I mean,
Do you
it's
remember any where you were like, no freaking way, this is the worst thing I've ever heard, or this team's never going to do it, and then they ended up becoming kind of a big deal, or?
oh yeah, I'm trying to think like which ones were they? I think it was. Yeah, there definitely were. I'm trying to remember what it was. It was a mortgage company, actually. It wasn't like I was like, oh, no way. I was kind of like, I don't really know. I'm not sure
Mm,
about these guys. And then they ended up, is it, I don't, is it Tedder Mortgage? I'm trying to remember what it is. I can't remember the name of the company now, but it
right.
was like it was a mortgage type company that I thought they were like I was like, oh, it could be interesting. I don't know. I wasn't sold by any means, and then like they've been doing incredibly well, and the name just escapes me now.
Well, what is it that made you say or recommend yes? You saw so many, I'm sure there were, really smart, cool ideas, big problems. Like what was the difference between the yes and the all the rest?
I wish it was that scientific. That's the dirty secret of VC, is right. Like it just isn't. It isn't. Like I don't. It's human powered decision making at the end of the
Yeah.
day, right? Like human powered decision making is by its very nature like irrational, and could have a good day, could have a bad day. I like obviously the founder is a huge part of it, right? Like the
Hmm.
founders, and And I think that this is a known thing in BC, right? Like BC's pattern match. There's a bias towards towards like white guys from Stanford. Like that's the reality that's there, and Harvard. And that was absolutely there. It was absolutely there. Even this is like I'm talking about 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
You try not to do that, but people do it anyway. And I think it's also like, I think one thing that's been really, really good and has changed a lot over the past 5 years is like everybody knows SaaS, right? Like SaaS is like, if you're in the SaaS space, like it's kind of like, okay, here are the boxes you check. These are the kinds of
Mm-hmm.
usually a lot easier to tell. It's like where there was a lot more like, I don't know, like could it be, couldn't it not be, is like these other spaces, right? Like D2C and definitely like the vertical space, like the bundling of stuff, like a full stack kind of company. And then also I think the other like kind of big trend is so SaaS and marketplace, I think really clearly and well-defined companies. I think in general, like the patterns that VCs use to like pick good SaaS company, bad SaaS company, good marketplace company, bad marketplace company, very clear and generally pretty spot on.
Mm.
The other types is deep tech and AI, like I think still very like speculative and unknown. I think we're still trying to figure out where these are. So I think where the like misses are in these other spaces versus the areas that people have known for a long time, like SaaS and marketplace. Like what's going to make for a good SaaS company generally, and what's going to make for a good marketplace company. And I think in general, most of the people that I worked with certainly were very good at understanding and kind of like sorting out where people were going to do well in those spaces.
Tell me about your decision to start your own company. Was that a no-brainer for you? Like, how did it happen?
It's not a no-brainer necessarily. I just knew I wasn't cut out to work for anyone else again. Um,
Travis was
so
enough.
no, it's like I try, I learned a lot from the guy. I got to give him that. It was more just like, fortunately as well, like I was in a position where financially I could make that choice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really privileged position to be in. It's
Yeah.
like, work, maybe, maybe not. Like I could make that choice. And if I'm going to make a decision about whether or not I want to work, like at that point in my mind, I was kind of like, well, if I don't have to work, like why would I work for someone else, right? Like I don't want to be told what to do. Like I'd really rather just do it myself. Um, and so I like what and my husband is also like was very much in that same place at the time, right? Where in that he was like, I've worked for everybody else for a really long time. I'd love to do something new. I'd love to do something different. And so we decided we'd start something together. So we got married. We both sold our houses in San Francisco, our condos in San Francisco, and we actually like packed everything in storage and went traveling around the world for a year. So we took like a really long honeymoon.
Mm.
And the plan was that at the end of that year, we were going to figure out what we wanted to do and also where we wanted to do it, right? So we weren't necessarily set on like coming back to America. We were kind of like, well, we'll go anywhere. Like I'm Canadian, he's Australian, which is part of the reason why we moved here. And it was like, let's just try it and see how it goes. Like, what's the worst case scenario? We'll move if we want to, right? And so that was very much the thing is like, so we actually on our trip had this Google Doc where we would just keep putting down startup ideas, and
Mm.
honestly, the vast majority of them are pretty terrible. I wouldn't recommend anyone do those. But like at some point, like we were just like, hey, this one feels like it's got some weight behind it. Let's try it. Let's see how it goes. And so we ran a bunch of Facebook ads when we had nothing. We just literally like created these fake Facebook ads and just people would click on it if they would even
Mm.
be interested in that kind of problem. And then spent like several months just doing customer research and like, hey, if this thing existed and it did this, would you pay X for it? Would you pay Y for it? Would you do these kinds of things? And then started building and putting a kind of a prototype together and working through that.
And then how close was the original idea to what you have now?
Pretty similar to be honest, like
Wow.
we had a lot of like it, details definitely, varied along the way, but in terms of what we thought we were going to do and what we actually ended up doing, it's like it is very much like what we set out to do. And I think even our vision, like when we look back at like our seed round decks from like 2017 and like our latest B deck, like
Mm.
the vision is very constant. Like from that time, and so I think that's actually been really good for us. Is that like we we had a process and a thought about what we wanted to do, and we did the kind of like upfront research around why we thought it would work. And I think it's like it's really it's validating that it's like really held true.
Yeah, that's so awesome. I mean, you see a lot of startups throw a lot against the wall, and some like figure it out at the 11th hour, some never do. What is it that you think was that what was most important in that process when you were originally coming up with the idea to help you kind of land on this vision that was so durable and authentic?
I mean, honestly, Tom, I think to some extent it was just luck. Like it's luck. It's also I think that like we'd seen a lot of companies. So like my husband's background, like I think the reason we work together and we're still married, you know, like even after doing this for years, is because our skill sets are quite complementary. So his background, like so at different, I run product design, engineering, and operations, which is where my experience is, and he runs everything else. So he runs sales, marketing, partnerships, finance, right?
Mhm.
He actually he went to business school and actually even graduated. So like it's a good blend. And I think that what it is that like, and then he had been, so he was like his background is like, you know, he was at BCG doing like consulting. He worked with a few other
Mhm.
companies before that. Then he went to Google and he was doing like biz ops and that kind of thing. Then he left and he went and he was working at SoftBank. So he was an investor at SoftBank, right? Like just as they started the Vision Fund.
Mm,
So he'd
mm,
also seen, and I think because we had this like mix of companies that we'd seen and visions that we'd seen, both like big and small, like from like my experience, like seed A and B stuff, and from his like super growth rounds and all of those sorts of things. Like I think we had like a good sense of like the kinds of companies that work and the kind and the way in which kind of like you think about industries. Like we're in the home business, right? Like that's the way we think about we don't think about ourselves as like a prop tech or like property management or whatever. We're a home business. What do people need from their homes? How do they think about it? And I think because we've seen a lot of companies, like, you know, we started this company when we were 35, right? So like we're slightly older than I think your typical startup founder. And I think because we've done a lot of the kind of like upfront research and thinking about like what is a good company, like do people even want this? Is there a market in the gap? Is there a gap in the market? Like that I think helped us really just solidify our thinking early on. And we're very open to changing things, by the way. It wasn't that like we were like, no, this is it, and we're not going to adapt or pivot or do anything. But I think part of the reason we didn't need to do as much pivoting is because like the problem was very clear. And we just focused on this one single problem and then had the story around it of like, what does this one single problem enable you to do?
and how is it that, you had that Google Doc and you had a lot of ideas? Some of them were pretty bad. I'm guessing there were other good ones. How did you decide to
Yeah,
go with this one?
I mean, you never know, right? Like, you never know until you do something whether or not it's going to be good. We landed on this one just because it was like it worked really well with our like early testing. It was like, hey, the Facebook ads had really good insight. The like, you know, the quick surveys had good insight. The people that we talked to like seemed excited, and like we asked people very consciously with like a price in mind, right? Like, you're not getting this
Mm.
thing for free. It's going to cost X. Are you going to buy it? Like, click here to give us your name and email and phone number, and then like we actually followed through and did that. So I think that gave us a lot of confidence that it was a good one. Like there may be some other good ideas on there, but like, you know, we had like kind of like 4 or 5 that we narrowed it down to, and the other 3 or 4 that we thought could be good, we didn't really get much like validation from them before we started doing any work on it. So we sort of nixed those and just worked on this one. So I think this was I think the fourth idea that we were like, oh yeah, this feels like it's getting some traction.
And the first 3, the ones that preceded it also felt like it was getting traction? They were getting traction or no?
They weren't really.
Yeah,
So that's why
okay.
we were like, oh, okay, put that on back. And there were
And
some that we didn't bother trying to test because we were just like, yeah, whatever. Like that one's not really gonna work.
and then after you started it and said, "Okay, this is the one," has it been has it been smooth sailing the whole time? Or
Oh my God, no. When is a startup ever smooth sailing? It
I
feels like
I know it sounds like, "What the hell?" So tell me
it's like,
about some of the challenges.
it's like constantly up and down, and especially like this is like an intensive operational business.
Mm,
So like it is a big deal. Like it's really like one of the trade-offs that we really had to try and make at times is to be like, okay, do we grow or do we scale? And like, because it's one thing to sign up people and bring on customers, but you have to keep servicing them. And you have to keep
Mhm.
servicing them with like real stuff that happens, right? It's not like, oh, like I couldn't like log in, or like I couldn't do this thing in like, it's like, hey, there's a swamp in my backyard. Like that's actually happened.
Mm.
Or, like the roof fell through. Like, I mean, you have to deal with stuff like this all the time, right? And like you deal with it in a regulated industry and you do all of that and you have to set it up and think through all of it. So like it's really hard. It's really hard because you're not just like, it's not just software, it's dealing with stuff in the physical world and like stuff that can go really wrong. Like they're a tradesperson, didn't show up. What do you do? How do you
Mm.
solve it? Like technology cannot solve that problem. It can only enable it and ease it up to a certain point. But it's this sort of like constant balance between technology and operations and trying to figure out how to make all those things fit together, how to grow, how to handle the scale, how to handle the volume, and how to keep being different and innovative in the process of what you're doing, and train people to like actually think differently about how they think of their property, right? Like, no, you can't pick up the phone to call us, and nor should you want to. Actually, you just click the button in the app. That's it. Press the button, and it's just done. It's taken care of for you. So like things like that are just like you have to change the way that people operate and work.
What were some of the things that you learned at Goldman and Google that you had to kind of unlearn as a early product founder at different, or
Yeah,
just toss away?
I think I've had to like unlearn a lot of that honestly through like the years before, like definitely
Yeah.
being at Microsoft and being at Uber too. Like you kind of, but it's I think the biggest thing is like speed to action, right? Like that is like you can't sit there and think too much. It's like having this, I think, like it's like the Amazon one way door, two-way door philosophy,
Mhm.
where like I think like at larger companies you sort of think of everything as a one-way door, and most of the time they aren't, right? And you really have to kind of get out of that habit where it's just like, okay, can we fail on this one? Cool, let's just do this and move on. Do this and move on. Do this. What's the consequences of failure? Low, medium, high, and then make the decision and move quickly through that. But I think that's the biggest thing is the action bias, which I think does peel back at a larger company, and it's much more. And it's almost like you need to figure out where on the action bias spectrum you need to be, right? Because like sometimes then you can get into the habit of making the decision too quickly, and it's not a good idea. You actually should have taken a little bit more time to think about it. So it's like that's also something that you almost have to unlearn that a little bit too as you get to later stages in a company, in a startup.
Yeah. No, it's so fascinating hearing kind of those two perspectives, and obviously it's a spectrum. Tell me a little bit about how a PM at a startup grows their career, or is it just, hey, help the company grow and hang on, great things will happen? Or do PMs in startups, do you think they have to think about their career development and growth?
No, I think that I do think career development and growth comes pretty naturally at a startup. Like I wouldn't,
Mm.
for example, we don't have like serious career ladders for like PMs here, mostly because most of the PMs I hire are all at the same sort of senior level.
Mm.
Um, but I think that like in terms of thinking about how you grow as a PM, I think at the end of the day, it's about challenging yourself to ask, how do I have impact on the business? Right? That's really all that matters. And maybe when you start out, you're like, look, I don't know enough yet or I don't know enough about anything to be able to figure out how to have a huge impact on the business. But here's this one thing that I know impacts the business and that I know I can make better. Right? And you don't have to make it 800 times better. You just make it 5% better every day, and it compounds, right? And so I think
Mhm.
that that's actually really the key thing in terms of like growth. It's like, what does product do at the end of the day, right? We ship, and we ship to do something. We ship to make the business better. So at the end of the day, it's like, why is what you're shipping making the business better? And it's about continually increasing the scope at which you make the business better. So when you start, like maybe you're an APM, or maybe you've just joined the company, or whatever it is, and you build the one feature that's going to make this one thing better, and you can quantitatively speak to it. It's not much, but it's a win, and it's a small win. And then you say, okay, cool, I made that thing better. What else can I make better? Is it this thing over here? And as you grow, you're like, then you understand the business better. You understand where it needs to be. And then you're like, here's this big thing that I can make better. Here's how I do it. This is the approach I'm going to take. Right. And so I think that it just naturally lends itself to that. And so, like, the more that your impact and grows in the business, like naturally the greater your scope of your role as a product person.
Yeah, that's an interesting emphasis on impacting the business. I've heard a lot of product folks take the position of being super customer obsessed. What's your view on? I know it's you kind of need both, but how do you think about that? Did you explicitly pick impact the business for a reason versus delight the customer or help the customer succeed?
Yeah, I guess in my mind, I think of those two as the same, right?
Mm,
Like, so we like if the customer is not happy at the end of the day, if you're not growing as a company,
mm,
like it's because the customer isn't happy. Like if you're losing customers, they're churning because you haven't done something right. If your ARR is not growing, like why isn't your ARR growing? Why aren't you helping them get through it? So it's to me, it's sort of like ultimately, how does the business win or fail? It's because you keep growing revenues and you do it sustainably. And you can only do that if your customers want to stay with you and
and
ultimately tell their friends.
and what do you think are the characteristics or the competencies that um, help great PMs make the most impact on that business?
Mm, so I think it's three things. Um, well, maybe four things. I'll tell you the stuff that I always look at and go into. The first one is ability to communicate. It's about telling the story, and it's about telling the narrative, right? Like, can you connect it all the way from what are we as a business trying to accomplish down to what does this feature do and why does it do it, and speaking at it at every level. And you have to be, it doesn't matter, like you change how you speak to like what you talk about when you're talking to an APM versus like when you're talking to like an external partner, but you should be able to tell that story at any level of it,
Mm.
and always pull it back up. So I think that that's a really critical thing. Whether that's in a written form, whether that's in an oral form, like the storytelling and the narrative is such an important piece of it. The second, I think, is like this balance between strategy and execution. And I think a lot of PMs sometimes get caught up in like, ooh, strategy, that's the thing that I need to do. Still, strategy is not important. Of course it is. But it's sort of like you also have to deliver. You
Mm.
have to deliver, right? So it's like, yes, develop the strategy, but make sure that you do whatever it takes to make it happen, right? Like you have to ship. And that's really, really critical because otherwise you haven't done anything. Like you can have the best strategy in the world, but if you don't execute on it, it's not going to matter. Um, and then I think the last piece is just like, it's just really cutting through the bullshit, right? And it's being super analytical. It's like, hey, this might be this great story that you told. And it might be that you like ship these things, but are you being honest? Are you actually looking at like what it did and why it did it? Like I personally am like very biased towards like PM should be able to like, if I need to write a query at like 11 p.m. to understand the answer to this question, I'm just going to go do it. I know the database well enough. Like I'll look at the schema, I'll figure it out and I'll write it. I don't have to wait for an analyst to help me put it together. Like I should just be able to go and do it. My level of the data and the knowledge of it should be deep enough that I get that.
Mm.
And like it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter like whether or not you are the founder or the CEO of the company or not. You should be able to do that. So for better or for worse, like people will argue that like, hey, that's getting too into the weeds on it. But like my personal thing around it is like I should be able to say it worked or it didn't work in a very honest way, and I'm perfectly okay with the fact that like I may have built something that failed. That's all right. I learned from it. I know why it failed. I know what it didn't do well. And I should be able to answer that with some level of like objectivity versus kind of being too caught up in the like, oh, but it's so like, it's the right thing and tells the story and it sells well, but it doesn't actually do what it's supposed to do. So I think those are like, for me, the three big buckets is like analytical, no BS, the ability to both strategize and deliver, and then I think the storytelling, the narrative piece of it, because you have to sell. People have to believe the vision and what you say, and that I think maybe colored to some extent by being a founder. I don't know that I
Mm.
necessarily would have like put as much emphasis on that earlier in my career, but I feel like it's something that for me as a producty founder has been really important.
You talked about the importance of cross-functional kind of relationships for a PM and as part of the interview process. I'm curious what your point of view is on how you as a PM in your career built successful cross-functional relationships. Like certainly the PM eng relationship is often an important one, but and then the design one as well. Tell me a little bit about kind of your approach to building those collaborative, cross-functional teams?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's three legs of a stool, right? Like, I think it's really important to develop those strong relationships with engineering and design. And I do think part of that comes from the leadership of that organization, whether or not they believe that. How like I like, for example, I think that engineering, product, and design are actually three separate disciplines that should have their own leaders. Like, you want to have, I think, somebody sitting across all of those three things, like at a C level. But I think that each of those is like a very specific discipline with its own kind of knowledge and background. So sometimes I've seen, for example, like a long short term, I think you could have somebody that leads both product and design. I think that's totally fine. But I do think that as a company matures and becomes larger, like you have a separate person who owns design, a separate person who owns product, and they both think about those things in that way. And I think that's really important that you set that up, that you treat all of them as equal citizens, and also that like you demand and expect that the leaders of those organizations work well together, because I think when you see that happening, that the leader of engineering, the leader of product, the leader of design are working really well together, that they are able to develop a cohesive strategy that everybody is on the same page about, that really cascades down well into these like cross-functional product teams that also have engineering, product, and design, and they see that from their leadership, they see that relationship happening, and they replicate it internally. And I think like a lot of a really, I think, important piece of product management is representing the people who aren't in the room. And sometimes it's like, okay, the customer's not in the room, so you represent that customer. Marketing's not in the room. But what if you're like having a discussion with your design team, and like engineering's not in the room? It's your job to represent engineering. And similarly, if you're having design with you're having a conversation with an engineering, and design doesn't have to be in the room, you have to represent design too. So it's remembering that like to be the voice for the people that aren't in the room. And I think that's really key. And when you model that behavior in product, I think then it flows through so that other people on the team also model that same behavior, so that like engineering and design, when they're talking to each other, they're like, hey, we should be thinking about what product says here too. Even if we don't have them in the room, doesn't mean we can't make a decision, but like we should make sure that we like continue to have this conversation, and that level of, I think, mutual respect really comes through.
Well, Mina, I feel like we could talk for a few more hours, but I know we scheduled 1 hour and we're at that point. Maybe my last question for you is, when you think back on your PM career, what do you think was like the hardest lesson that you learned that then like made you a better PM later?
Ooh, that's a tough question, Tom. um hmm I don't know that I could answer it in necessarily one thing, but I think it's building bad products, or building products that didn't work.
Mm.
Uh, so like I had this whole idea about like kind of like testing like price elasticity with at Uber, like to get a sense of like, would discounts and how we set them up cause people um, to ride more, or ride more frequently, or do these things. And honestly, I had not set it up well. I hadn't thought through it properly. I didn't have the right structure. And most importantly, I didn't bring in the right people. Like that's not my background, right? Like testing like price elasticity experiments. And I think like one of my biggest learnings was when it's like so much of what PM is like you work in a space where like you've never done anything like that before and you don't know anything about it. And it's actually completely okay to say, hey, I don't know anything about this. Let me bring in the people, or let me go do the research, or let me figure out the things I need to learn in order to figure out how do I construct a good pricing experiment. Like that is and I pull out the pricing experiment specifically, but like it's that thing of like, I'm going to build something in this area. Here's the thing I'm trying to accomplish. Here's the goal I'm trying to have. What do I not know? And actually just being very open to like, I have no knowledge in these things. How do I build knowledge? Either I go and become a subject matter expert myself, or I pull subject matter experts into it. And I think that was probably one of like the biggest things that for me, like I've tried to like really get better at, is when I don't know something, like fully be very comfortable and confident with that, and either decide, do I need to go learn, or do I need to bring somebody else who knows it in and really involve them closely and tightly in it? Because at the end of the day, what I know or don't know is not as important as what I ship.
Mm, words to live by. So, before we wrap up, for people who are curious about different, I'm guessing with that 25 million, you're going to be doing some hiring.
Oh
um,
my God, so much hiring. If you are in Sydney
yeah.
or want to come to Sydney, please do. Different.com.au/careers.
Hmm.
I think I have like 12 roles up now in Sydney: engineering, product design, content design, you name it. Like, I'm hiring. So please. I'm very open, by the way, to sponsoring Americans to come live in beautiful Australia. It's summertime in Sydney. It's going to be lovely and warm, and you can surf. So yeah, take a look. Let me know if you're interested.
And is your philosophy, you are, you want everyone co-located in the office in Sydney, or what's your take on virtual
We're
people?
hybrid, actually. So we're going to be moving to a new office space soon. It's a
Hmm.
really beautiful office space on the water, actually. So we're in the office
Mm.
sort of 2 to 3 days a week, and the rest of the time, however you want to be. You can come into the office as often as you want to, if you want. But we ask that people come in 2 or 3 days a week. And so we've got a team in Sydney. We've also got a large team in Colombo, Sri Lanka, and we do, when we can, a lot of back and forth travel between those two areas. So yeah.
Right on. Well, Mina, it's just a pleasure. It's a real pleasure seeing you again. I'm so thrilled that you've been able to have such a amazing journey, and congrats on all the success with different and your international adventure and just living life. And of course, best of luck with the pregnancy and the new child on the way.
Thank you, Tom. So great to catch up after such a long time. It's
I
really,
know. It
yeah.
was I still remember doing Tamberg video conferences from Kirkland, and you'd be down in Mountain View, and we'd be talking about ads.
Campaign insights. I'll never forget it.
Well, with that, I'm gonna let you go, and thank you again. Take care, Mina.
Thanks, Tom. Bye.
Bye.